Wednesday, April 10th, 1912. Dawn greeted the Southampton waterfront at 5:23 a.m. The skies were overcast with occasional breaks that allowed the sun to break through with stunning radiance. It was not a particularly warm day, with morning temperatures of about 48 degrees Fahrenheit, or around 9 degrees Celsius, and with fresh northwesterly winds that ensured that overcoats and warm clothes would be the rule rather than the exception. Titanic towered over the city of Southampton, ensconced safely in berth 44, and serving as the very heart of the hurricane of activity that was to come as the day got underway. It was sailing day, the culmination of 3 years and 10 days of hard work since the first plates of her keel had been laid in Belfast on March 31st, 1909. The liner's passengers and crew began showing up in an ever-growing human tide, converging on and surrounding the great liner as she prepared to begin her maiden voyage. However, like everything else over the past few weeks that had happened around Titanic's fitting out, trials, and the rush of trying to finish the ship to sail to Southampton, very little would go according to plan on this day as Titanic started out on her maiden voyage to New York. The day began early for everyone involved with the sailing, as there was much to do before the scheduled departure time of noon. Captain Smith left his home at about 7 a.m., stopping to take the morning paper from the newspaper boy as he passed. Titanic's captain boarded the ship at about 7:30 a.m. Board of Trade Immigration Officer Maurice Clark boarded at about the same time as Captain Smith. Both men certainly had a long list of things to take care of before they could clear the ship for departure. White Star's Marine Superintendent for Southampton, Captain Benjamin Steele, was also responsible for making sure that as far as the White Star Line was concerned, Titanic really was ready to sail. The crew's formal muster was held at 8 a.m., where they had to assemble for a head count and produce sign-on sheets. A few crewmen who had signed aboard on April 6th had not shown up, and a few replacements were quickly signed on in their place. The muster was largely complete by about 9 a.m. At that point, any who were off-duty, like some off-duty firemen, were able to go ashore for a last pint. The victualling department staff, however, was extremely busy preparing for and then tending to arriving passengers. After the muster, almost the entirety of the ship's deck department proceeded to the starboard boat deck to partake in a lifeboat drill. Chief Officer Wilde, First Officer Murdoch, Second Officer Lightoller, Third Officer Pittman, Fifth Officer Lowe, and Sixth Officer Moody were all assembled with the men by boats numbers 11 and 13, the two craft selected for the test. These two boats were uncovered, swung out, lowered to the edge of the deck, and then 8 crewmen wearing life belts were placed into each. Captain Clark and Captain Steele oversaw the entire proceeding. Lowe manned boat number 11, and Moody took command of boat number 13. Then the two boats were lowered to the water, where they were rowed around the waterfront for a couple of turns before being brought back up to the deck. The drill lasted in all about a half an hour. It would have lasted longer and would usually have included raising the lifeboat's sails as a test, but because of the gusty winds that morning, that portion of the drill was canceled. The results of the drill were entirely satisfactory, and the men were dismissed. By this point, the 2 boat trains from London's Waterloo Station were inbound and nearing Southampton and Titanic. Over the years, there's been much confusion about the time that the boat trains actually left London and what time they arrived in Southampton, and even in what order. According to most, but not all, of those who were aboard the first-class train, they had left London at 8 a.m., and recollections were pretty consistent that they arrived at Southampton at about 11:30 a.m., a half an hour before sailing time. However, recollections about when the second and third class boat train actually left London and when it arrived in Southampton are much more widely varied. In either case, both trains arrived in Southampton in time to make sure their passengers were able to sail with Titanic. Many other passengers had chosen to travel to Southampton in advance and had stayed in local hotels. The Southwestern Hotel was a popular choice. Thomas Andrews had been staying there all week, and J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, had traveled down with his wife Julia and his 3 youngest children. Unlike the previous year on Olympic's maiden voyage, Ismay's family would not be accompanying him on this trip. In fact, the maiden voyage of Titanic, as exciting as it was in some ways being treated as a sort of repeat performance of Olympic's maiden voyage the preceding June. As the clock inched toward noon and more passengers arrived and boarded Titanic, things continued to get busier and busier. A number of people visited the ship that morning, including artist Norman Wilkinson, who had painted 2 masterpieces for the Olympic-class liner's first-class smoking rooms. One group of 8 men who came aboard that morning fell into an odd category. They were neither, and both, passengers and crew members. These men were the 8 musicians who had been hired to perform during Titanic's maiden voyage. The 8 men were divided into 2 groups, a 5-man quintet led by violinist Wallace Hartley, and a trio that was set to perform exclusively in the a la carte restaurant reception room aft on B deck by the grand staircase. Technically, these 8 men were booked as passengers for the upcoming trip. However, the White Star Line had engaged them through the Black Brothers Agency out of Liverpool, England. Although not direct employees of the White Star Line, these musicians were without a doubt there to work during the maiden voyage. The quintet performed a set daily schedule, playing in various locations in first and second classes at different times of the day. It's interesting to note that as late as March 23, 1912, just 3 weeks before Titanic sailed, the Black Brothers Agency was still advertising for a lead violinist and bandmaster for the quintet aboard Titanic. To our knowledge, this particular ad and detail have never been shared anywhere before, and it means that the agency was still casting a wide net for this position, rather close to Titanic's actual sailing date. First-class passengers boarded at B deck, just beside the suite and private promenade that Bruce Ismay was ensconced in, B-52, 54, and 56. Meanwhile, second-class passengers boarded on C deck astern, coming aboard via the sheltered promenade there. This is what first-class passengers would have seen upon first boarding the ship and coming through the vestibule into the main first-class entrance on B deck. The purser's office and enquiry office on C deck, just 1 deck below, was a focal point of much activity on sailing day. As passengers boarded the ship, they proceeded there for information on how to find their cabins, deposit valuables for safekeeping, exchange money, arrange for table assignments in the dining saloon, to rent steamer chairs or rugs for the voyage, or to arrange for their rebate if they would be taking all their meals aboard the ship in the a la carte restaurant rather than the main dining saloon. The barriers separating the first and second class areas of the ship were open that morning, and second class passengers had the opportunity to explore the various first class decks, dining saloons, and libraries. While a group of second class passengers, including Lawrence Beasley, visited the gymnasium and tried out the equipment, instructor Thomas W. Macaulay came in with a pair of photographers from the Illustrated London News. Macaulay insisted that the group stay on the equipment while they were photographed using it. Second-class passenger Lillian Bentham, whose personal recollections of her experiences aboard Titanic were recently covered in an episode of In Their Own Words on our channel, was actually photographed there. So was Lawrence Beasley. As passengers found their cabins and began to familiarize themselves with their surroundings, most were very impressed with the new ship. Many remarked on the tastefulness of the design and decor, of how it was such a high quality, that it hardly felt like one was aboard a ship. One non-passenger who toured the ship that morning, whose name was Ernest Townley, remarked that Titanic's interior arrangements and appointments were so palatial that one forgot now and then that she was a big ship at all. She seemed to be a spacious, regal home of the princes. However, 2 individuals who boarded that morning proved the old adage that you can't please everyone all the time. Imanita Shelley and her mother Ludi Parrish found their second-class cabin unacceptably small. They labeled it a cell and said that they could not call it a cabin. In addition to complaints about the size of the room as opposed to their expectations, they gave a litany of grievances about the decor. The 2 ladies would hound the stewards and Purser McElroy throughout the voyage. Just forward of the gymnasium on the bridge, Titanic's senior officers met with Captain Smith, Captain Clark, and Captain Steele. The ship's officers made their official status reports to the effect that Titanic was ready to sail. Captain Steele and Captain Clark then went ashore. As the morning had progressed, pilot George Boyer stepped back aboard the decks of Titanic. As soon as the ship was completely ready, he would be taking charge of the task of bringing the massive liner out of Southampton waters and to the open sea. Smoke began to waft from the funnels as the stokers built a full head of steam in the boiler rooms below, preparing to depart in short order. At 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the scheduled sailing time, the bells clanged and there came cries of all ashore throughout the ship. Streams of visitors said their goodbyes and descended the gangplanks. Thomas Andrews took the opportunity to say goodbye to Thomas Hamilton and others who were not going to accompany the ship on the maiden voyage. His spirits were high and he said, "Remember now and keep Mrs. Andrews informed of any news of the vessel." Most of the off-duty stokers who had decided to go ashore after the muster were back on board already, many of them not daring to cut things too fine. But there were a few stragglers. Titanic's officers made their way to their departure stations. Chief Officer Wilde was at the head of the forecastle, overseeing the crew working on the mooring lines. Second Officer Lightoller was a bit further aft on the forecastle, working under Wilde's direction. At the opposite end of the ship, First Officer Murdoch was on the poop deck, in charge of the mooring lines there. Assisting him was Third Officer Pittman, who stood by the telephone and telegraphs on the stern docking bridge. Fourth Officer Boxall was on the bridge, seeing to giving orders on the telegraphs and keeping the ship's log filled in. Fifth Officer Lowe was inside the wheelhouse, working the telephones. Sixth Officer Moody was below, at the head of the last gangway connecting the ship with the shore. It was astern on E-deck, located just off the main crew thoroughfare, Scotland Road. Just after noon, the massive triple-toned whistles atop the forward 2 funnels sounded their breathtakingly loud cry 3 times, signaling that Titanic was about to depart. A last knot of straggling firemen rushed along the pier toward their ship. Another group of 6 crewmen were also rushing down the docks. Fireman John Podesta and his friend William Nutbean were with Alfred, Bertram, and Tom Slade, 3 brothers, and a trimmer named Penny. The group had gone to the pub at Newcastle Hotel, leaving there at 11:15 a.m. But then they had proceeded to a second pub called the Grapes for another round. The group had ended up staying there for a little too long, leaving it only 10 minutes to 12. They were coming down the pier when a train approached, about to cross their path. Podesta and Nutbean decided to cross the tracks before the train passed, but the Slades and Penny held back until after it passed. Podesta and Nutbean made it up the gangway and passed 6th Officer Moody safely. Then the Slades and Penny arrived. However, the last gangway was pulled ashore, and they were unable to board. A bevy of tugboats approached Titanic and were made fast to the ship to help ease her away from the pier into the main channel. With the final gangways disconnected, but the 2 shell doors on E-deck astern not yet closed, the order came down from the bridge to cast off. The men on the dock slipped the mooring lines of the bollards and cast them into the murky water between the dock and the ship's side, one by one. The tugs began to ease Titanic away from berth number 44. Some evidence indicates that Titanic was already a few minutes behind schedule, although her sailing was recorded in the harbor master's log as being at noon sharp. Recollections were that she had sailed anywhere between 12 sharp and 12:15. At this point, we should probably pause and consider a long-standing point of contention regarding Titanic's departure. Many books, television programs, and movies portray a band playing from shore when the ship sailed. But then it was said that no music was being played as Titanic was sailing. As far as we can currently tell, no band had actually been engaged to play on the dock, although documentation on this point could easily become available in the future. So what did people who were actually there remember? We found a clear recollection from Turkish bath stewardess Annie Caton, who said, "The ship's band was playing a lively tune on deck. Passengers leaning over the rails waved farewell greetings to their friends and gave answering cheers." This is a very interesting statement considering the fact that the five-man ensemble, led by Wallace Hartley, was scheduled to play music aboard the ship every day from the first-class entrance on the boat deck at the top of the grand staircase between 11 a.m. and 12 noon, Titanic's scheduled sailing time. Is it possible that Wallace Hartley and his musicians played their first official performance together, an hour of music in the entrance, as Titanic's passengers were boarding? Had they perhaps stayed just a few minutes longer than their scheduled hour, playing the lively tune that Annie Caton recalled they were performing as Titanic was casting off? The tugs slowly maneuvered Titanic forward until she was clear of the docks, and gently turned her to port until she was pointed down the River Test. The maneuvers needed to be made cautiously to avoid an incident. As Titanic was drawing an average of 34 feet 0 inches of water and 4 inches beyond that at the stern, and as the tide was not anywhere near its peak, there was very little room between Titanic's hull and the bottom of the river. One observer on shore that morning remembered, "It is doubtful whether the Olympic has ever cleared the new dock in such a splendid manner as did the Titanic on this occasion. From the moment she began to move from her berth in that dock, she was under absolute control, and she passed out of the dock not only majestically, but also smoothly and calmly." The tugs turned Titanic around the knuckle at the pier's edge, and then the liner was pointed southeast and the main body of the River Test more or less parallel with berths 38 to 41. At that point, not all of the attending tugs had cast off, but some, like the tug Vulcan, had let go. From the bridge, Pilot Boyer had ordered Titanic's engines engaged at slow ahead. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell, down on the starting platform in the engine room, had promptly opened up the steam lines. The engines, powerless up to that point in the departure, began to come to life, turning the two outboard props, but not the central propeller driven by the turbine, with gathering momentum. Suddenly, among the crowd still waving handkerchiefs, there was a sudden silence. The gigantic triple expansion engines had begun to work. However, what happened next nearly ended the maiden voyage before it began. Directly the huge screws of the Titanic began to revolve, the reporter from the Irish Times recalled, they began to build up a powerful and complex series of forces in the confined waters on the northern side of the deep water channel. The force began to exert an irresistible influence on the American liner New York, and the result was both immediate and shocking. Lawrence Beasley said that, as the bows of our ship came about level with those of the New York, there came a series of reports like those of a revolver, and on the quay side of the New York, snaky coils of thick rope flung themselves high in the air and fell backwards among the crowd, which retreated in alarm to escape the flying ropes. We hoped that no one was struck by the ropes, but a sailor next to me was certain he saw a woman carried away to receive attention. And then, to our amazement, the New York crept towards us, slowly and stealthily, as if drawn by some invisible force which she was powerless to withstand. On the New York there was shouting of orders, sailors running to and fro, paying out ropes and putting mats over the side where it seemed likely we should collide. Up forward on the bridge there came the sound of the telegraph handles jangling. In response, the throb of Titanic's engines ceased completely. However, the dominoes were already set in motion, and the New York's stern continued its arc toward Titanic's after port flanks. One of the two officers at the stern of Titanic called out to Captain Gale of the tug Vulcan via a megaphone. He ordered Gale to proceed to the port side stern of the Titanic. Meanwhile, the engine order telegraphs on Titanic's bridge rang out again, and the liner's port engine was reversed. Captain Gale saw that the port engine was engaged in reverse as he came around the port side. He proceeded to get a line on the port stern of New York. Although that line immediately parted under the strain, he quickly got a second one attached and began to drive his tug at full power, trying to slow and then stop the American vessel's stern-first dash toward Titanic. Between the reverse wash from Titanic's port propeller and the frenzied attempts of the tug Vulcan, the New York stopped its forward advance. Captain Gale later swore that by that point there were only 4 feet separating the two hulls. Titanic saloon steward John Jack Butterworth thought that the two ships were so close that one could have tossed a penny onto the New York from the Titanic. Meanwhile, Titanic herself began to move astern, and a delicate ballet of enormous steel vessels and tugboats ensued, with Titanic backing straight up the channel, and the tugs trying to make sure that her motion did not cause New York to start toward her afresh. Once Oceanic and New York were both squared away, Titanic resumed her downriver journey. Then she paused, and the tug Vulcan nudged along the afterport quarter of the liner. It next took some minutes for the standby crewmen, who had not disembarked earlier, to board the tug through the after gangway on E-deck. Ahead of Titanic lay a course of about 25 land miles of water before she reached the Nab Light. This navigational aid, which sat off the eastern shore of the Isle of Wight, marked the end point of Southampton water and the starting point to the open waters of the English Channel. Although Titanic had only just begun her maiden voyage, she was already behind schedule. Passing from the White Star dock and steaming southeast down the River Test was a relatively straightforward affair. It encompassed about an hour's steaming once the New York incident had been resolved and Titanic's engines were restarted. For this journey, the ship was brought up to a speed of about 20 knots, and the central turbine was not engaged. Shortly after the liner's trip down the Test had resumed, ship's bugler Peter Fletcher began to play the roast beef of Old England, signaling that lunch was being served. Francis Brown recalled that this, the first meal served aboard the liner, was a very brief affair. Everyone was anxious to be on deck while the ship steamed down the channel between England and the Isle of Wight. At the bottom of the River Test, the channel diverged to the east and southwest around the Isle of Wight. Although the western passage was a more direct route to open water and Cherbourg, which was west of their current position, that channel was not dredged deeply enough to accommodate the White Star liner's draft. Titanic was thus forced to take the eastern passage, which was known as the Solent. The reverse S-curve to enter the Solent was tricky, taking about 10 minutes to execute from beginning to end. In the course of this maneuver, Titanic slowed, turned first to starboard and then to port, before finally settling on a southeast by east course and re-engaging the engines at full ahead, coming back up to a speed of about 20 knots. From that point, it took about 3/4 of an hour for the ship to reach the Nab Light and the open water of the English Channel. At the Nab Light, Titanic stood poised to begin the first open water stage of her crossing. Her mighty power plant was brought up to a reading of 68 r.p.m. on the reciprocating engines, indicating a speed of about 20.2 knots through the water. 65 nautical miles away lay the breakwater which shielded the harbor at Cherbourg, France, her first port of call. The liner set her bow south-southwest, making a beeline for that port as she tried to make up for lost time. The weather on that short journey was splendid, calm and clear, if cool and overcast. The cool temperatures as well as the breeze on decks prompted many passengers to procure a good steamer rug for themselves while sitting in their deck chair. However, the conditions were far from inclement or unpleasant. There were other things going on behind the scenes that also needed to be tended to. For example, wholly unknown to Titanic's passengers and most of her crew, there was a problem brewing below decks: a fire in one of the coal bunkers. In point of fact, this fire did not threaten to cause the ship to go up in a giant plume of smoke, fricasseeing passengers while they slept. Instead, it was wholly confined to the starboard coal bunker at the forward end of boiler room number 5. Bunker fires were a rather common problem on coal-fired ships. Coal stored in a bunker near a source of heat was well known at the time to be susceptible to spontaneous combustion. According to one second-hand report, the fire had begun at Belfast over a week before the liner departed on her maiden voyage, although confirmation of this is hard to come by. While not unheard of, leaving a coal fire unattended simply wouldn't do. As soon as the ship cleared Southampton, Chief Engineer Bell approached leading fireman Frederick Barrett and ordered him to begin the task of extinguishing it. By using the coal in that bunker as quickly as possible, it was hoped that the actual source of the fire could be exposed and removed sooner rather than later. By way of explanation, Bell said to Barrett, "Builders' men want to inspect that bulkhead." Accordingly, a hose was run into the bunker, and it was going all the time under the watchful eye of Barrett and a team of between 8 and 10 stokers. Unfortunately for the men, getting to the bottom of the pile where the fire was smoldering was going to take some time. Meanwhile, Titanic proceeded across the channel to her very first port of call, Cherbourg, France. In Cherbourg, passengers intending to take passage on Titanic had begun to congregate. The boat train from Paris arrived at about 4 p.m., bringing with it most of those who were planning to take passage on the liner. As Titanic approached the Cherbourg breakwater, passenger Francis Brown and a number in his traveling party took the opportunity to bid farewell to some of their acquaintances from that day who were to disembark at the French port. They were still saying their goodbyes when the ship's bugler sounded the call to dinner. A number of individuals, Brown recalled, had to ask him for directions on how to find the dining saloon. Eventually, at about 6:30 p.m., Titanic dropped anchor inside the breakwater with her starboard side facing south toward the city of Cherbourg. The sky was still quite light, as sunset would not take place for another 20 minutes at around 6:50 p.m. The White Star tendered traffic tied up alongside first, taking the cross-channel mails, depositing mails bound for Queenstown or New York, and transferring third-class passengers to the liner. As the tender Nomadic steamed out across Cherbourg Harbor, darkness began to envelop the great ship, and Titanic's lights all began to flicker to life until she looked like a city afloat. She truly was a magnificent spectacle. Thomas Andrews watched Nomadic and traffic at work that evening. He wrote to his wife that night, "We reached here in nice time and took on board quite a number of passengers. The 2 little tenders looked well. You will remember we built them about a year ago. We expect to arrive at Queenstown about 10:30 a.m. tomorrow. The weather is fine and everything's shaping for a good voyage. I have a seat at the doctor's table." In all, some 172 first and second class passengers boarded at Cherbourg, in addition to 102 third class passengers, for a total of 274. At the same time, some 15 first class and 9 second class passengers disembarked at the French port. Many items of mail, cargo, and luggage were also moved off the ship and onto the tenders. The process had taken quite some time, about an hour and a half from when the ship had first stopped. She finally weighed anchor at about 8:10 p.m. and steamed past the breakwater, bound for her next port of call, Queenstown, now known as Cove, Ireland. After dinner, the ship's first-class passengers enjoyed music by the quintet led by Wallace Hartley in the first-class reception room on D-deck just forward of the dining saloon. This concert performance was held between 8 and 9:15 p.m. One passenger, whose name has not survived, wrote, "After dinner, as we sat in the beautiful lounge listening to the White Star Orchestra playing the Tales of Hoffmann and Cavalleria Rusticana selections, more than once we heard the remark, 'You would never imagine you were on board a ship.'" No matter how enthused passengers were over the ship and its wonders, eventually the exertions of the day caught up with everyone. Many were tired. Beyond that, a number of the passengers later said that they were completely exhausted. Eventually, the concert wound down, passengers began to drift off to their cabins and staterooms throughout the ship, and sailing day officially began to wrap up. Overnight, Titanic's engines were built up from the 68 RPM made during the trip to Cherbourg up to 70 RPM. This indicated a speed of about 20.7 knots through the water. As the ship had been late in departing Cherbourg, it's clear that the trip over to Queenstown had to be made at a very good speed. Considering the fact that she was then working on steam from only 20 of her 29 boilers, this speed was quite a respectable showing. Overnight, Titanic steamed generally west and northwest. At midnight, the ship's clocks were set back by 25 minutes from Greenwich Mean Time to match Dublin Mean Time. Dublin Mean Time encompassed Queenstown, Titanic's next port of call. A special thank you to our supporters on Patreon: NikkiChan92, Evan Fleming, Lucas Sidlowski, Bluebird Nut, Mark Gegenheimer, Martin Cahill, Maximilian Metcalf, Rachel Warner Sanchez, and Snow Monkey.